When I say the word prove, usually people think like, wow, he's going to change reality, or whoa, he's going to come up with brand new data that contradicts everything else. He's going to change the paradigm. No, that's not really what the word prove means. It means I have a really good argument. It means I'm going to engage in discussion and explain how I view things, and and I think it's a correct way, so I'm going to claim that it's proof. Basically, science. What science is it has to do with collecting data, and it also has to do with discussion. There's two sides to science: data, discussion, or philosophy, or metaphysics, or analytics. It's the discussion side, the part where you do analysis, and then there's the part where you try to you challenge your analysis by searching for empirical evidence, and that evidence, that data, will either back up or destroy your analysis. It's a two-sided coin, science. As time goes on, the data is pretty good. The data is good. The collection of data, the act of collecting data, is a technical task. It's a technical task, and we just keep getting better at it. For a lot of discussions, the data is really, really good, beautiful, perfect data, and everyone agrees upon it because they've been collecting the same data for 100 years, and it's within 100 decimal places, and you know, the people doing it are capable, and they're meticulous geniuses, and they never lie or make any mistakes or anything. So the data is really, really good, and we all agree upon it. Okay, let's assume that. Let's assume, because basically that's where you start. If you don't agree on the data, then get the data right. Okay, everyone can agree upon that. And on some things, we have really, really good, perfect data, and we all agree upon the data. And yet somehow, even though a lot of people agree upon the perfect, beautiful, excellent data, there are people that have different analyses of that data. What? Why? How does that happen? If you have perfect data, how can you have multiple people with multiple ways of looking at things? How does that even happen? A lot of people just say, "Oh, that's not possible." It just look at the data and be unbiased and don't have any analysis at all, but that's impossible. And when you just say, oh, there's only one way of looking at things, there's only one way to analyze that data that's correct, there's a word for that. It's called dogma. Okay? It's called religious dogma. And yes, I'm using the term religious dogma because, you know, once your academia starts doing that, it becomes a hegemony. It becomes like a religion, if you're being polite. But actually, it's cult. You know, academia largely has become a cult for that one reason. There's only one way to look at the data. There's only one way to do an analysis of the data. And yet, that's not true, is it? There's a bunch of ways to analyze the same perfect, beautiful data that everyone agrees upon. Okay? So the question is, why? How is it that people look at the same data and agree upon it, and it's beautiful and perfect, and yet there are differences in how we analyze the data? Well, the answer is that our human brains are trying to make sense of the data. And we, as humans, go through a certain process to make sense of that data. And this process eventually makes you end up in one of several different analyses. There's really only a few different ways you can analyze data. And if you're going down to the fundamental, metaphysical ways to look at things, there's really only four. There are really only four: monism, dualism, physicalism, and idealism. And so that's why you have theories about reality, where they look at the same data, everyone agrees upon the same data, and the theories kind of maybe sound a little bit similar, yet somehow they're fundamentally different from each other. That's because as our minds try to make sense of things, everyone falls into one of four slots. And guess what? One of those four slots really does make more sense than the others. Let's talk about dualists for a second. So, dualists, they want to make sense of the world around them. They agree upon the data, and they see two categories, two broad categories: physical and non-physical. So how they make sense of the world is that they say that this non-physical category made the physical category pop into existence. And to the dualist, that makes sense. It explains the physical category. But then when you want to explain the non-physical category, it doesn't make sense anymore. Because you can't say, oh, the physical category made it pop into existence. No, you can't say that. It doesn't make sense anymore. So it makes sense for a while, but ultimately, the whole thing doesn't really make sense. And that's because the non-physical category is really just not defined as being made up of anything else. It's just the non-physical category, and it just exists. And you have to keep coming up with categories that created it for it to make sense, and that leads to infinite regress. So let's move dualism aside. It doesn't really make sense ultimately. Okay, let's move to physicalism. So a physicalist, they're trying to make sense of reality, and so they have a few categories: physical and non-physical, and they have figured out how to explain the non-physical category. Everything that's not physical, they've explained it, and it makes perfect sense to them. It's a subset of the physical category. Makes perfect sense. It completely explains everything non-physical. But then when you go to explain the physical category, things start falling apart, because what makes the physical category? Where did that come from? And that too leads to infinite regress, because they want to, make physical a subset of the physical category, and it just like, okay, that thing there, what is it made out of? Physical particles? What are the physical particles made out of? Smaller physical particles? And so on and so forth. Infinite regress. Okay, let's move that aside. Physicalism doesn't really make sense ultimately. Okay, let's talk about idealism now. It's the other way around. They have the categories physical and non-physical, and they've explained the physical category because it's actually a subset of the non-physical. But ultimately it doesn't make sense because they didn't explain the non-physical category. When they go to explain the non-physical category, they say, well, it's a subset of the non-physical category, but that leads to infinite regress. I've actually had this conversation with idealists. I say, well, if your consciousness creates the entire universe, then what is your consciousness made out of? And they say, frequencies. I say, well, what are frequencies made out of? And they actually say smaller frequencies. Okay. So ultimately that doesn't really make sense. And it's because the non-physical category is just the way you think about the category. It's just not really defined as being made up of anything else. It's just the it doesn't make sense. And then you move on to monism, which actually does make sense. Okay, monism. Let's say you're using the categories physical and non-physical. Monism is the idea that those two categories are interdependent. You can't have one without the other. When you take away the physical, you also take away the non-physical. They can't be separated. When something physical happens, something non-physical happens, and vice versa. And that, saying it in that way isn't perfect. The better way to define those categories is to simply define them as things that make up other things and things that are made up of other things. And so the words for that would be essence and substance. All a substance is something that is made up of essences. And all an essence is something that makes up substances. There's no physical or non-physical. I think that those terms as ontological categories just help in the huge collective obfuscation that we're going through currently. I say get rid of them. I say you don't talk about things in terms of physical and non-physical. Those categories, just ultimately, it's going to lead to confusion. Call it substance and essence. Okay, so how does that prove the ether? It must be that our categories exist in such a way so that one category is the thing that makes up everything else, and the other category is a collection of those things. When you contemplate light and you ask, what is light made out of? The contemporary analysis so far is well, it's kind of like a particle, and it's kind of like a wave. Now, an interesting thing that I want to point out, which I think should be really obvious to people, is that when you say the word particle, what you're really referring to is the category of physical. It's physicality. It's a unit of physicalness, a particle. And as for waves, well, waves need a medium. And that word medium, well, aren't you still referring to the category of physical if you're referring to a medium? These words, particle and medium, they don't have a clear definition. They're not put into any particular ontological category. Really, ontologically speaking, metaphysically speaking, the words are meaningless. And yeah, this topic is very very challenging because, well, when they did the original Madison Morley, I think, experiment, the idea was that well, the Earth is moving through like some kind of a medium, and the medium is standing still, and the Earth is moving through it. So they tried to measure that. So based upon how they understood it, they made certain measurements. They collected certain data. the discussion side of science is absolutely necessary, because your discussions, all they change is how you understand the data, how you understand reality. Your discussions don't change the data at all. The data is perfect, and you know, so it's really just your analysis that is changing. And you need to have a skepticism and open-mindedness to be able to have discussions, so that when in the future you make different measurements, you're going in the right direction. And you're not going around in circles. Really, we're going around in circles these days. And it's because of that. It's not an issue, it's not a technical issue of measurement or collecting data. It's an issue of being able to discuss things from the perspective of metaphysics, from the fundamental levels. So, when you say the word ether, what is it you actually mean? Are you referring to a physical medium? When people hear the word ether, they think in a very shallow way, oh, that person is so dumb. Doesn't he know that we have disproved the ether? And that condescending person, they don't know what the word ether means. They'll say a medium, but what category are they referring to? Are they referring to physical, non-physical, essence, substance? What are they talking about? Even they don't know. And really no one knows. Forget the way. Yeah, today it's like, oh, well, doesn't he know that we've disproved the ether? Now it's called the Aether or the Aether. Now it's called the Aether. Wow, he's so dumb. It's called something else. I think there's something else I want to throw in this video. Recently I made a video about stereographic projection, and in that video I basically said, well, the geometry of fields kind of looks like stereographic projection geometry. So there's some kind of connection there, I think. It appears to be so, okay? Simple argument. There's certain information that is attached to that statement, which is very, very interesting. Such as, well, how is it that this geometry exists out there in the world as a field? Like, it doesn't even make sense. Geometry is like a human construct. Well, actually, no. According to monism, the thing that makes sense, geometry, well, the word geometry obviously is, wouldn't exist if you and I didn't exist. The word geometry wouldn't exist, but geometry shapes would exist. I mean, they exist without us being here. It's an objective thing. Geometry is an objective thing. And using the concept like geometry, I think would be a helpful tool to fix the problem of infinite regress. I think that the concept of geometry or shapes out there in the world are something that exists in objective reality, and I would view those shapes, or just shape or geometry in general, as essence. And viewing it that way means that the reduction has a place to end up at. Just having essences and viewing geometry as an objective thing, it fixes the problem of infinite regress. Because you ask the question, well, what is that made of? It's made of particles. And particles are smaller substances. But what are those made out of? Well, they're made out of geometry. Geometry that exists objectively out there. And then it ends. Because geometry is an essence, and it simply exists. Just because you have these two categories that are defined in such a way, substance being defined as being made up of essences, and essences being defined as making up substances, just because you define your categories like that, it fixes infinite regress and things make sense. It's really hard to go from there and say, well, a luminiferous ether exists or a medium exists, because, well, you're just kind of saying it's a physical particles, and the words don't matter. It's the concept of an essence and the relation it plays with everything else. That's my point that I'm trying to explain. I could come up with other examples like the color red. The color red is used a lot in consciousness science to explain this very concept. This concept is people try to explain this concept in a whole bunch of different ways. Okay, and people tend to use the color red. Basically, the concept is that the color red exists objectively out there. And it also exists objectively as an experience. And wherever it is, it exists, and it's objective, and it's an essence. And it's the same thing, whether it's in here or out there or wherever it is. It doesn't matter, because it just exists objectively. And it's really what the color red is a description. Now that word too is also confusing, because usually you use that term as in like a tool used by a person. Like I'm creating that description, but actually you're just borrowing it. Things are already perfectly described in the metaphysical sense. And when we're perceiving things, we are not really describing them. We're just perceiving how they're already described. So it's a very abstract concept. Things are described. Shapes, geometries, colors, sizes, etc. They exist out there. Numbers even, or values, who knows? It's essences. And essences combine somehow to make up everything that we see around us. And we find something on the ground like a piece of gravel. We say, oh, that's a substance. And it's a physical substance, practically speaking. But what's it made out of? Little smaller rocks or minerals, individual elements, individual atoms. And what are atoms? Well, they might be made of smaller particles, but eventually you're going to end up at a point where it's just a shape, or it's just a characteristic like spin. And really what spin is an essence that is a geometry And it's a geometry that just because of how it works, just because of the geometry itself, just because of how it's shaped, it acts a certain way. And all of the essences do this. And this is fact. This is not, I'm not just making this stuff up. This is contemporary science. It is a known fact that fields, for instance, are well, one way to look at them is as vectors that go on forever in that way, which means they extend throughout the universe for infinity. And they do combine together in a hierarchical and self-similar way, and that process is called coherence. And I think that coherence happens just because of the shape, the geometry, the stereographic projection geometry. And so magnetism in general and magnetic coherence I see as part of the ether, or an essence. Really, the ether, I'm saying that the ether is the entire collection of essences that are out there that are combining in different ways to make up all the substances around us. There are a number of essences out there. I would say a large number of essences, distinct. And I think it is possible to identify them clearly based on geometry. And so when I say the word ether, what I'm referring to are essentially fields that are known and fields that are yet to be understood by people. There's one thing I want to kind of go into a little bit. I go into this in great detail in my book, but I'm just going to touch on it a little bit. Stereographic projection is a kind of projection. What a projection is it's a transformation of one kind of geometry into a different kind of geometry, namely a three-dimensional sphere into a two-dimensional plane. In the context of magnetic fields, though, it would be a fourth-dimensional sphere, a hypersphere, being represented as a three-dimensional geometry that extends throughout the universe and combines through coherence in a self-similar and hierarchical way because of geometry. And then looking at it as a hypersphere, well, that's I'm getting into this analysis, which really the end result is that every point or every point is its own field, its own reference frame, and the further away you get from a point, the more reality distorts. And this is just it doesn't matter whether you go into stereographic geometry or if you go into the holographic principle or you go into the relativity. You're going to end up at the same point, and that is basically the concept that a reference frame is not just something you and I made up, or Einstein made up. It's not just something that's made up. It's not just a construct. It exists as an objective part of reality. And understanding it from that point of view, I think, would help people understand light better. Because people say, yeah, okay, there's reference frames, but then what they do is they take this measurement here and this measurement over here and all the other measurements in all these different places, and they take a step back and they look at the universe in its entirety in like an objective way. But really, that kind of contradicts the idea of a reference frame, because, you know, a reference frame is a reference frame, and all of the light is defined in terms of a single reference frame, not from all of them. If you look at light in the concept of all of the reference frames, then light is like speeding up and slowing down and like changing directions and doing all this weird stuff. It's only when you look at light from the perspective of a single reference frame that it just makes sense. It makes sense because it just goes the same speed no matter what from a single reference frame. So I think the whole thing to take from this is that reference frames they're just like a real thing, and that's like the whole concept of like a particle and a wave and stuff. I think that's like complicating it. I think you're making the issue a lot more complicated than it is. It's a known fact that light is basically caused by a change back and forth in polarization of the electric field and magnetic field. Change in polarization back and forth real fast. And really what a photon is that reference frame, that observer, perceiving a change in polarity from over in that direction. And that reference frame has its own view of reality, because there are field lines connecting to that reference frame. Now, there is a certain objectivity, but also there isn't. And the reason for that is that reality or fields, essences, exist in a hierarchical fashion. You can look at one section of the hierarchy, one reference frame, and view things from that perspective, or you can take a step back and look at the larger field. Okay, when you say, okay, that's a field right there, you're not actually saying that's a field right there, because 1 million fields make up that field. And that field you're pointing at is 1 in 1 million that make up a larger field. So you're not really pointing at like one reference frame. Like that one field isn't creating all of reality. It exists in an objective world. It's just because of how essences work. And it's not physical or non-physical. It's a physical force in the sense that, well, things are moving around and things are attracted to each other. But it's non-physical in the sense that, well, it's not like billiard balls. And that's another thing. Billiard balls hitting each other, um, that's there are forces at play. Okay, it's not as simple as, oh, there's a physical object here and a physical object there. There are at the atomic level, there are non-physical forces causing things to happen. And when you drop a pebble in a pond and you see the waves spread out, the particles are pushing against each other in a certain way. Yeah, they're physical particles, but why are they pushing on each other in that way? Why aren't they pushing on each other in a different way? So you would ask the same question for a light medium as well. And the answer is inevitably, well, there's a certain essence driving the physical forces within those water molecules in the pond. It doesn't matter that they're physical. I mean, there could be physical particles that are waving around, causing light to act like a wave. But even if there were physical particles causing light, you would still need to explain those particles. See what I mean? And the only way you can really make sense of it is to define your categories as substance and essence.